Hello, everyone. How'd it go? We're okay? We're good? All right, how many cookies did you have at the end? That's what matters. That's what matters. You had the intention to have many. I love it. So I just want to make a few things clear. Make a few things clear before we start. Some people asked a really helpful question, which is, what's the difference between ritual and habit? And I'm going to give you what the conventional difference is between ritual and habit, but I don't think it's always true. Habit is meant to be something where you made a decision to do something once, and you continue to do it probably without making any sort of conscious decision after that. That's habit. Ritual is usually something that you didn't decide or create on your own, but was somewhat externally imposed upon you. Not by obligation, but just maybe by idea. So if you take something like the ritual of drinking coffee in the morning, it would be difficult to say if that's a habit or a ritual. I think that's a ritual. I think other people would argue that that's a habit. So I'm going to stick with my definition of ritual, which is basically an activity that you repeat over and over again, that you didn't necessarily only think up yourself, but perhaps you did, but usually not. And it has some sort of formal rules and guidelines. The second point that I want to make, and this I can't make this point enough, which is what I'm trying to do here, and hopefully what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to think about ritual as it impacts any and all Jews. Whether they see that ritual as something that they are commanded to do, they see that ritual as something they are choosing to do, they see that ritual as something that is essential to their Judaism, or they see that ritual as something that happens to be a part of their Judaism. I want to make that incredibly clear, because the texts that you were reading in your Chavruta sessions were quite traditional texts, in the sense of ritual equals mitzvah, ritual equals commandment. And what I really, really, really do not want anyone to walk away with is, well, it doesn't seem like this is relevant to the kind of ritual I do or don't do. My position here is that it's relevant to any and all ritual that people do that relates to Judaism. And just walk into a synagogue on Yom Kippur evening, no matter what denomination, you will see rituals upon rituals upon rituals being performed for many different reasons in many different ways. So that's just something that I want to make clear. How many people here got through the Maimonides sources? Great. How many people here got through the Zohar and Hasidic sources? How many people here got through the Musar source? How many people here got through the Leibovich source? Wow, you guys, this is good. How many people got to the case studies in the Babylonian Talmud? Okay, so we have a bit. So I want to make something clear. When we started before Chavruta time, I mentioned that Adam Seligman does something really unique in suggesting that there's a dichotomy between the ritual self, which is the self that performs, and the sincere self, which is how you think you feel about how you think you feel. Your total inside of what you are. And I asked you to look at the sources that I provided for Chavruta in an effort to see three different approaches to the question of connection between the ritual self and the sincere self. And I'd like to posit that these are the three approaches that you saw. And perhaps when we get to the question and answer piece, people might add other approaches that they might have seen. But I'll tell you what I intended. What I intended is that you note the rationalist school and the mystical school both going in the same direction. And that direction is that the internal self and the external self are inextricably linked in a causal way. And I will give you an example, or what I think is maybe the example. You bring your 5-year-old with you to a Yom HaShoah program. You don't bring her with you because she already feels what Yom HaShoah means. You bring her with you to shape her internal self, to shape her sincere self into caring about this, into thinking about this. When she's 25 and she on her own goes to a Yom HaShoah commemoration, you hope that it's because those feelings that you try to instill in her, she has them. And thus the ritual of going there is an expression of those feelings. That's the loop of Maimonides telling me that the mitzvot have reasons and that I have to keep those reasons in mind when I do them. And also that those mitzvot will teach me how to think. So it's a loop. The ritual is going to shape my sincere self. My sincere self is then going to do the ritual as an expression of that sincere self. And the Kabbalistic material is actually not so different. Because the Zohar tells us, wow, what's at stake in ritual? You are literally connecting to, quote unquote, the body of God. You are literally connecting to God. So ritual is the most important thing because you're connecting to God. But what the Hasidim did with it is they said, well, if you do this without dveikut, without communion, and you do this without thought of God, well, the ritual is not enough. It's got to be the sincere self. What's going on inside is actually what's primary. It's actually what matters. And the ritual self is an expression of that. Or the ritual self helps you learn about communion and shape your internal self. And so the ritual is just in service of the internal self. Everybody see that move? Now the issue with that move, it's a beautiful move. It's a move that in many ways I believe and hold on to and love. But the issue is that actually means that ritual is not primary. Ritual is either an expression of something more essential, which is your belief, or it's something that's supposed to shape that belief. So if you ask me what's primary, the performance or the inside, I'm going to tell you the inside, right? So it's a little bit difficult to try to figure out, once you've got the inside, what are you doing with the ritual, right? And this is an argument that the Reform movement makes, right? I just heard a yeah, Reform, yeah, okay? Represent Reform movement, right? This is a move that Philo, I would say this is a move that the Reform movement makes, and yet there's so much ritual in the Reform movement. Because, as I said in our opening, people have a hard time being disembodied. We're embodied. And I want to talk about that. This is why it's pan-Jewish. Okay? So Philo had this issue. Number 3. Philo, as a rationalist, right? He's not coming from the mystical school, but as a rationalist, is looking at this and he says, well, I'm not really sure why the ritual. Oh, don't worry, I'll tell you where we're going. I'm giving you we're in the orange. We're in the orange. So Philo, he struggles with this in number 3. Philo finds himself first century before the Common Era, first century of the Common Era. He kind of spans that fun no man's land. And he says, on the migration of Abraham in number 3, in 90, but now people living solitarily by themselves, as if they were in a desert, or else as if they were mere souls unconnected with the body, and as if they had no knowledge of any city or village or house, or in short of any company of people whatsoever, overlook what appears to the many to be true, and seek for plain, naked truth by itself, whom the sacred scripture teaches not to neglect a good reputation, and not to break through any established custom, which divine people of greater wisdom than any in our time have enacted or established. So the first move that Philo makes is smarter people than we are the ones who put this into action, right? He's fighting something. 91. For although the seventh day is a lesson to teach us the power which exists in the uncreated God, and also that the creature is entitled to rest from their labors, it does not follow that on that account we may abrogate the laws which are established respecting it, so as to light a fire, or till land, or carry burdens, or bring accusations, or conduct suits at law, etc., etc. 92, nor does it follow, because the feast is a symbol of the joy of the soul and of its gratitude towards God, that we are to repudiate the assemblies ordained at the periodical seasons of the year. So instead, in 93, he tries to figure out, okay, why should rituals still be done? But it is right to think that this class of things resembles the body, and the other class, the soul, Therefore, just as we take care of the body because it is the abode of the soul, so also we must take care of the laws that are enacted in plain terms. For while they are regarded, those other things also will be more clearly understood, of which these laws are the symbols. And in the same way, one will escape blame and accusation from men in general. Anyone see what happened in the last sentence? Which is, you got to do this so that people don't think that you're abandoning something. Fascinating. So he makes three arguments. One is people who are wiser than we came up with this. Second argument is this will actually help us understand our belief more. And third argument is, well, I can't really drop this because people will say this is a problem that you drop this. What you see in front of you is the problem of that very strong connection between the internal and the external. Which is, if the internal and the external are so linked and the internal is clearly primary, then what's the use of the external? And thus, you don't have to have a conversation about external and internal because all you really want is the internal. That's one approach that you saw. The second approach that you saw is what I would call the Musar approach. The Musar movement, a 19th century Lithuanian ethical self-improvement movement. I gave you a source from Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, I first read him when I was a kid, and I was like, oh, how come nobody talks like this? How come nobody tells me how to behave nicely and kindly to other people? And then I said, I should close this book before I learn a little too much about that. But what he gives us is something totally unique. If you were to try to figure out the relationship between the sincere self, the inner guts of who you are, and the ritual self, the performances that you do, what is that connection for Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto? Or for Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, for instance, the founder of the Musar movement? What is that relationship? It's not the relationship of the rituals will teach you how to be. It's not that. Because clearly he's looking at a group of people who are performing those rituals and it's not teaching them to be the way that he wants them to be. What he basically says is, you want to learn how to improve your sincere self? Go to the self-help aisle at Barnes & Noble or on your Kindle. Don't go to ritual. Ritual is not what's going to teach it to you. And even though I do not think for a minute that the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, had this in mind, my good friend and colleague, Shaul Magid, points out that this separation sows the seeds of secularism. Number 6 in your orange handout. Charles Taylor, the philosopher, begins his Sources of the Self with the following assertion: selfhood and the good, or in another way, selfhood and morality, turn out to be inextricably intertwined themes. Tying theories of modern selfhood to morality, not only how we should act, but as important, the sources we draw from in determining how we should act and how they are interpreted, stand at the center of my inquiry in regards to what I will call modern Musar, better known as the Musar movement, initiated by Israel Salanter in 19th century Eastern and Central Europe. I will argue that Musar offers an innovative theory of self, deeply embedded in traditional society and thus Jewish law halacha, yet introduces, articulates, and or perhaps anticipates a notion of autonomy that plants the seeds of a kind of secularism that later emerges in the neo-Musar movement in contemporary America. I use secular in a very narrow sense to refer to ways of constructing the self as an autonomous agent which can determine proper behavior, originally tied to but not identical with traditional authority structures, particularly the active Torah study and the obligatory nature of Jewish law. Secular here needn't deny God by definition, but it does incorporate competing, sometimes even alternative forms of agency in regards to human flourishing. So, scandalously, what he suggests is, without knowing it perhaps, the Musar movement, by separating the inner self and the outer self, sows the seeds for what we might think about as the Neo-Musar movement, which is people can open up Ira Stone's wonderful translation, part of which you read today, of a book of Musar like Ramchal's, read it, feel connected to it, feel like it is giving self-help in a way, teaching humility, teaching actual reverence for others and care, patience, etc. But when you say to that person, do you want to come to my high holiday service? They say to you, what does one have to do with the other? That's the setup. The inner self has its own track, and the performative self has its own track. And here again, what is emphasized is the inner track. Now, he's not emphasizing, Ramchal, the inner track because he doesn't care about the outer track. He's emphasizing the inner track, and by the way, making it an outer track because he's saying read the book over and over and over again, which is a ritual in and of itself. But he's emphasizing the inner track because he sees that people aren't doing it. And so he wants that track. But separating them is an interesting business. They're separate. So still the focus is not on the actual action. So still I don't have an explanation why people connect in ways to ritual, or why ritual is such a big part of our embodied life. And I'm not comfortable just saying ritual is just the clothing that faith wears. It just doesn't do it for me. Doesn't do it for me. The third approach, Yeshayahu Leibovich, who basically, he's a scientist, and he says, science of Judaism, here we go. These things, the ritual is what matters. The internal feeling, it's not my problem. Now, what's interesting about his perspective is that he basically says, now we know why ritual matters. Ritual matters because ritual matters. It's God's command, so ritual matters. So commandedness. But there are two issues. One, if you don't have a theory of commandedness, and ritual means something to you, what does it mean to you? And the second is that he doesn't care about the spirituality that comes along with it. So that's a harsh, it's kind of harsh. By the way, the same harshness that allowed him to be an incredible moralist when it came to Israeli politics without trying to get himself too emotionally invested. So there's a side of that coin that people might relate to, and there's a side of that coin that people might not relate to. I think it's interesting. So that one finally says ritual, but the definition of ritual is so black and white. Some Jews may relate to it. I think it's a very, 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 very few who engage in ritual solely or without thought as to the spiritual benefits that it provides them or the social benefits that it provides them, but only because it's a command, if they have a commandedness theory to begin with. So he focuses on ritual, but I don't think that's going to get us to our pan-Jewish theory of ritual. But as I mentioned in my opening, I think all three of these have something. They have something, and different people relate to different ones, and some relate to none, and some relate to all. But I want to do something else. And the way I want to do it is by learning two passages in the Babylonian Talmud, in the Gemara, about kavanah, about intention. And I want us to try to see what's beneath these passages. What are the rabbis not saying, but are actually saying with every line? We're in number 7 in the orange booklet. Does anybody here does anybody here own a Sefer Torah? Holy cow. I'm coming to your house. So in this situation, you have someone who owns, not necessarily that they own a Torah scroll. They're reading a Torah scroll, okay? We're going to look at two passages. One is in Brachot 13a, which is about the recitation of Shema and Kavanah that relates to it. And the other is in the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah that's going to deal with questions of eating matzah and listening to the shofar. You'll notice already I want you to notice already when I tell you I'm setting you up for a conversation about intention regarding Shema, Matzah, and hearing Shofar. I'm sure you'll notice already that all three of these are very different kinds of actions from each other. A recitation of words, presumably words that mean something, a performance of a mechanical action, and a listening, which is maybe somewhere in between, but I'm not sure. We'll see. So the Babylonian Talmud in Brachot 13a, the Mishnah tells us, if one was reading from Torah, meaning someone's reading from a Torah scroll, Haya Koreh B'Torah, and it comes time for the Shema. V'higia zman hamikra, comes time for the Shema. Now, I a little bit wonder, like, how early in the morning are you sitting there reading from your Torah that it's now time for Shema, which is pretty early in the morning? Or how late are you reading from your Torah that it's now time? So it's an interesting, to begin with, it's an interesting setup. So, very simple, the Mishnah tells us. Very simple. You're reading Torah. You're in Parshat Ve'etchanan of the Shema. Comes time to read the Shema. Im kivein libo yatsa. If a person had intention, they fulfilled. Okay, so sounds like intention is required, right? Well, let's see. So the Gemara's conversation basically is, from this ruling, it seems that mitzvot require internal intention. Shema mina mitzvot tzrichot kavanah. Oh, not so fast, not so fast. And I'm going to start talking about this as ritual and sincere, if you don't mind. I'm going to use those terms. And not so fast that you're going to assume that the ritual requires this sincerity. What does it mean if one had intention? Mai im kivein libo? Likrot, to read. If one had intention to read. Likrot, intention to read. Vahakakari, a person's reading already. What are you talking about? So really what this Mishnah is telling me, the big innovation of this Mishnah, is that I'm reading from the Torah, and I'm in the Parsha of Shema, and it's time to say Shema, and when it's time to say Shema, I say, okay, now I'm having intention to read. Nothing to do with the fact that it's a religious ritual. Nothing to do with what the words mean. None of it. Oh, no. That is actually innovative. Why? Because before I was reading to just fix the scroll, B'korei lahagia. I was fixing the scroll because I was, like ma. Like I wasn't reading properly necessarily. So now I'm going to read properly. Now I'm going to read straight through. And then the Gemara goes on. Now, just a show of hands. Let's not do a show of hands. Then the Gemara goes on. So you don't even know what I was going to ask. Then the Gemara goes on to try to figure out, well, let's talk a little bit about this intention stuff. And one of the nice things about the Shema is that for the rabbis, it is self-referential. So when the Shema says, and these words that I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall learn them with your children and speak about them, etc., the rabbis take this as actually referring to the prayer of the Shema itself. So that's where we're going to look at, do you require intention? Well, certainly, because the Shema says, and these words should be on your heart. Intention, right? So the Shema, you have to have intention. So we're continuing in the Hebrew/Aramaic on the first line of the Gemara at the end. The rabbis taught, Tanu Rabbanan, Vehayu, and they shall be. From that verse, and these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. Okay? What does it mean? And they shall be? Shelo yikra lemafreya. You can't read backwards. Hadvarim, the words, al levavecha, on your heart. Well, actually, you know what that teaches you? You might have thought that you needed intention for the entire Shema. You actually only need intention up to this verse. Because the Shema says, and these words, only up to this pasuk, you have to have intention. Yacholte kol parsha tzricha kavana, Talmud lomar, ha'ele, these words. Ad kan tzricha kavana, mikan ve'elach ein tzricha kavana. Until here you require kavana, afterwards you don't. So really, if you're reading words and you have no intention of anything, what exactly are you doing? you're doing a ritual with no interiority whatsoever. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer, that's Rabbi Eliezer. Amarle Rabbi Akiva says, no. Harehu Omer, the verse also says, all that I command you this day, Asher Anochi Mitzavcha Hayom, should be on your heart, Alavavecha. Meaning, Mikan Ata Lamed, you learn from here, Shekol HaParasha Kula Tzricha Kavana, that you need intention for the whole paragraph. What about the other two paragraphs? This is quite strange. You take something that seems to be so intention-laden, so explicit in its requirement for intention, and you say, well, actually, if you did or you didn't, maybe till here, maybe till there. Now, of course, the rabbis are not saying you should do this without intention. But the notion of being able to see that a person might recite without any intention at all, or might start with a lot of intention and then lose it, that's not surprising to them. They're not surprised. And what I'm wondering is, why not say to the person, well, you should go say it again. Like that was a useless, you should go say it again. Do it again. More than that, what I wonder is, how enforceable is this? This is not enforceable. What is this conversation about having intention, not having intention? I'm going to find out. Did anybody here ever have like a teacher who tried to figure out if you were like really saying the words or not? So my third grade teacher, she didn't know. I was like reciting lyrics to Sesame Street, and she was like, that is beautiful prayer, Elana. And I'm like, you have no idea what's going on. And that made me very happy. But I think the point here is that it's unenforceable. Why are you even having a conversation about something where you're never actually going to know? Okay, so you know why? Because what we're trying to say is that it actually is the ritual that matters, and it's not your inside. Because what we're trying to say is that we really want you to have, intention, but we know sometimes that you don't. You know what I think is under this entire thing? It's a realization that when someone is doing a performance, we have no idea what they're thinking. None whatsoever. Have you ever had the conversation like I am right now, where people are looking at you or you're looking at them and you think they are listening to you, every word, and you say to them, so yeah, right? And they say, oh, I'm sorry, I was spacing out. I was using your face as a reflective staring pool, right? That's what I was doing. You have no idea what is going through a person's head when they are reciting the Shema. And the rabbis are totally aware of it. They're a little bit trying to police it and a little bit not trying to police it. And that's important. That there's actually, it's not just a perspective, it's the dominant perspective here that you don't need kavanah for most of the Shema. That's radical. That's totally radical. And Yeshayahu Leibovitz loves it, understandably, right? But the point is, there's something, they realize that they don't know. They're never going to know. When you get to the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah in number 8, it gets, I think, even more interesting. Because I'm going to ask you a question. How many people here think that the shofar blast sounds like crying? How many people here think that the shofar blast sounds like a jubilant, triumphant call? How many people here are reminded of a siren they once heard when they hear the shofar blast? How many people here feel like the shofar is an alarm clock of some sort? How many people here try to completely void their minds when they're listening to the shofar? Keep all of those in mind as we read the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah. They sent a question to Shmuel's father, Shalchu leila avua de Shmuel. This is number 8. If someone forced a person to eat matzah, now you tell me, do you ever not feel forced to eat matzah? Like, come on, guys. Kva'o ve'achal matzah. Yatza. You've performed your duty. Wait a second. Who forced you? Kva'o man, who forced you? If you say it was like a demon that forced you, ilema kva'o shade, meaning you had some sort of hallucination, Well, that doesn't work, because we've learned in an early source, V'hatanya, don't we learn in a Braita, that if a person is sometimes lucid and sometimes hallucinating, basically, or not lucid, okay, itim chalim v'itim shoteh, well, when that person is lucid, kishehu chalim, they can perform mitzvot and it works, quote unquote. Hareu kipikeach l'chol dvarav, they're like a person who's always lucid. But kishehu shoteh, when they're having a hallucination, hareu kishoteh l'chol dvarav, that's not a person who has an obligation to do mitzvot. That doesn't really work. So it can't be an internal demon. And this is my favorite. Amar Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, Shekfa'uhu parsim. The Persians made him do it. And I love that, because there really were religious arguments between Zoroastrians and Jews at the time. But I love the idea of the Persians saying, no, you're going to eat that matzah because we know what it tastes like. You got to eat it. So somebody forced you to eat that matzah. Okay? Guess what? You are Yotze. And by the way, no one's arguing here. Amar Rava. Rava says, well, you know what this tells me? Zodomeret, that somebody, a jazz musician who blows a shofar to make nice music, also fulfilled the shofar requirement too. Hatokei l'shir yatsa. Somebody who just blows it for music. Of course, pshita, obviously. Hainuhach, it's the same thing. Whether you eat matzah because somebody forced you, or you blow a shofar for music and you're not thinking about religious rite at all, same thing. What might you have said? Mahu detema, what might you have said? Hatam, there, in the case of matzah, the Torah says, echol matzah, amar Rachmana. The Torah says, eat matzah, meaning it's just about an action. V'ha'achal. And a person did it, they ate it. But regarding the shofar, the Torah says zichron trua. It has to be a remembrance of a blast. So meaning there has to be some sort of cognition that happens there. But this person, v'hai mitasek bi'almahu, this person is just playing around, so to speak. So kamash malan, that teaches us, nope, it's the same thing. Kavanah is not something that is going to ruin the experience. And then, of course, the Gemara comes in with our earlier passage in the Gemara. And I'm going to switch to English. On the next page, on page 6. Rava believes that fulfilling commandments does not require intention. But what about another early source, the source we just saw a minute ago? If one was reading the section of the Torah which includes the Shema, if one has intention to recite the Shema, and then one fulfills the commandment of reciting the Shema, and if one does not have such intention, one does not fulfill. So how could you possibly say that ritual does not require your inner self? After all, we have another source that tells us ritual does require your inner self. By the way, I could distinguish between those two very easily, which is it's ridiculous to read words without knowing what they mean versus eating a piece of matzah. I could, okay? Does this not refer to intention to fulfill a mitzvah, to commit a ritual religious act or religious ritual act? And only if you have such intention can you actually fulfill the religious ritual? If so, how can Rava suggest that the fulfillment of mitzvot requires no intention? No. The source refers to having intention to read, as we saw before. Intention to read, the person is already reading. No, the person was reading as a scribe to make corrections to the Torah scroll. Come and hear the answer based on another instance. If one was walking behind the synagogue or lived near the synagogue and heard the sound of the shofar or of the Megillah, if one had intention, one fulfilled their obligation, and if one did not have intention, one did not fulfill one's obligation. There we go. We're back to ritual requires sincerity. Does this not refer to obligation to fulfill a commandment? No, it refers to intention to listen. Just like you had intention to read, now you have intention to listen. Intention to listen, you heard the sounds automatically. No, you might have thought it was a braying donkey. So you have to realize what it is. Let's talk about what's said here and what's not said. First of all, you have that same knowledge of not actually being able to police this boundary because it's an internal boundary. But besides for that, do you know what kind of intention is not spoken about? The kind of intention that I just asked you about. You can tell me I have intention that this is a ritual of some sort, even a religious ritual. but you still didn't explain to me like what it actually means, right? So I still don't have to think it's a cry or a blast or I could void my mind. They couldn't go that next step. That next step is for philosophers of Jewish ritual to go. What does it mean? What does it not mean? And this, my friends, is, I think, the countercultural move. Everybody likes to talk about the internal self and how performance is an external husk of an internal self. But people don't deal with the fact that humanity loves the external self. We love doing certain things, and we love repeating them, and we love getting involved in them. They bring us nostalgia, and we think about them. And I want to understand, what is a theory of that externality that can unite Jews and the world? But let's start small, right? What is a theory of externality that is a unifying factor? And that is one word: ambiguity. Ambiguity. One thing that ritual can give to everyone, if they choose to allow it to do so, is the reality of not knowing. Let's talk about the things that are ambiguous about ritual. One thing that's ambiguous about ritual: I don't know what it does. Another thing that's ambiguous about ritual: I don't know which part of it actually does something. Another thing that's ambiguous about ritual: I don't know exactly what I'm supposed to think when I do it. Another thing that's ambiguous about ritual: I have no idea what you're thinking when you do it. Another thing that's ambiguous about ritual, back to the wonderful question earlier about as if, creating an as if reality. Have you ever walked into a room and you saw someone doing a ritual and you said, I don't know what's going on here, but something's going on here, and I should sort of tread lightly and be careful? You have no idea what it means to that person in that moment. You don't know if it's true. There's so much about ritual that's just ambiguous. And the rabbis recognize it. Before trying to stuff it in a box and explain what every single ritual means to every single person, or before trying to say it's just the external husk of this, that, or the other. So Leibovitz's answer is, it's a commandment. That's what it is. Now, from my perspective, while I may feel that, that doesn't unite me with the Jewish people. It doesn't unite me with the Jewish people, and all of our arguments that we're all going to have about ritual, do it this way, do it that way, don't do this, do that. It's necessary, it's unnecessary. It's not going to help me. But you know who's going to help me? Adam Seligman's going to help me. Let's look at some Seligman. We're still in our orange pieces. He says, let's be honest. If the ritual self is about ambiguity, the sincere self is about authenticity. What you really believe. Do you want to know what the person next to you is doing here at Hartman? Or do you not want to know? Would you rather know what people are doing at your Passover Seder? Or would you rather not know? Would you rather live among people who think and believe exactly as you do in every situation? Or would you rather be able to share something that's a little bigger with others? Adam Seligman, number 11. We can accumulate great quantities of discourse, but never dispel the suspicion, even within our own minds, that it is all just artifice. The Calvinists, am I really saved? And the teenagers, am I really in love? Are at heart similar kinds of questions. Don't give me as if. Tell me what is. Don't ask me to recite a prayer and not know if there's someone on the other side listening to it. Tell me what's actually happening. I need to know, is there a God there listening to me or not? Is God going to say yes or no? You can't ask me to walk into this ambiguous moment. It's not fair. That's not fair. After 3 decades of marriage, and I recognize what we're about to read might feel very familiar to some and very alien to others. It's a case study. I would actually put, instead of marriage, any relationship with another human being. And relationships to other things as well, but we'll get to that. After 3 decades of marriage, kids, laundry, mortgages, funerals, fights, and in-laws, which I used to think were the same thing, the relationship tends to, until I met my in-laws, the relationship tends to be sustained by a shared as-if rather than a continued as-is. We're in number 11 on page 7 of the orange. Relationships that fail to construct a shared subjunctive over the long term tend to fall apart. It is not enough to love each other sincerely if people fail to act as if they love each other. And acting as if they love each other includes ritualized forms of expressing concern, verbally and in concrete deeds of helpfulness. If anybody here has ever had a roommate, and you do something around the apartment or the house, New York, the apartment or the house, that benefits the roommate, and the roommate comes to you later and he says to you, that was so thoughtful, you knew I wanted us to do that and you did it. And you're thinking to yourself, I have no idea what he's talking about, but I'm going to let that shared subjunctive live. I am not going to ruin that by saying, no, I was doing it because I couldn't stand that thing, so I moved it. No, that's the wrong thing to do. The wrong thing to do is to try to be so authentic. I need to be myself all the time, fundamental, my interpretation. Because you know what happens? Then you can't share with anybody. Anti-ritualist attitudes deny the value to the subjunctive of play, convention, and illusion. They seek to root interactions in some attestation to the sincerity of the interlocutors. Now, I'm going to give you an example. Are you a communist or are you not a communist? I need to know. Do you believe in this way of Judaism or not? I need to know before I can learn with you, before you can be in my synagogue, before I can be in your synagogue. I need to know. That, my friends, is not ambiguity. That, my friends, is, get ready for the word, fundamentalism. Ritual gets this name for being fundamentalist. You know why? Because we're fundamentalists about it. Which is to say, I do it my way, you do it your way, so you're out, I'm in. Right? But hold on. Seligman says there's something else here for us. There's something else here for us. If we could all, in the way that we do and we don't, if we could all appreciate the fuzziness, the play, the illusion, the inability to actually know exactly, by the way, even if it's a ritual that you yourself do, how you feel about it today versus how you feel about it tomorrow, how you're going to express it to me when I ask you versus how you really feel about it if you were sitting by yourself and you asked yourself. We need to feel that. We need to experience that. I mean, America looks crazy from Israel right now. I don't know if you feel that way. It looks crazy. America looks crazy. I'm looking at America and I'm like, I'm good here. I'm going to stay here. And one of the things that's so crazy about America, not in general, what's feeling crazy about America, is the inability to share space. The inability to share things without us each having to own it and define it and set its parameters. Let's skip in Seligman. Let's skip to one, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom on page 7. Thus, for example, he says, we can in the end distinguish 2 forms of the words I love you. The emotionally wrought confession by the star-struck young person appeals to the sincere mode. Of course, like all language of sincerity, we have doubts. Perhaps that person is just trying to get their partner into bed. Or perhaps that person is indeed sincere. and having established this as is of love, will never feel the need to say those words again. Good luck with that. Even through decades of marriage. This person may also fail to say those words ever again because they aren't sincerely experiencing the same kind of love as when they first fell in love. On the other hand, we also have the ritual I love you, whose performative aspect is more important than its denotative function. This is why one can repeat it for years and years to the same person. In so doing, one is not adding any bit of hitherto unknown information, but instead acting out a ritual, rather in the manner of a prayer. Have you ever been on the phone with someone and they ended the phone call with, "I love you"? Have you ever said, "Really? Could you explain to me why?" No. No. Live in that. Live in that. I want to just emphasize again how this is different from the other perspectives that we've seen. One perspective that we've seen is both Maimonidean and mystical, and suggests that there's a loop between your inner self and your outer self. The outer self is going to shape the inner self, and the inner self is going to express itself through the outer self. The second approach is putting them on two different tracks, but caring more to speak about, at least at the moment, the inner self. The third approach is putting them on different tracks, Leibovitz, and caring about the ritual self to sometimes the exclusion of the inner self. What I'm doing here is something different, which is let's focus on the ritual self. Let's focus on the ritual self for something that it gives the sincere self, not always in a dogmatic way, but in an overarching life lesson kind of way. The fact that you and I can perform the very same act at the very same time, in the very same room, and not know what the other one is thinking, that's powerful. That means something. And that's something that, ironically, if the shedding of ritual was a corrective, was supposed to be a corrective for the erasure of the individual before the Enlightenment, Seligman is offering that today, performance can be a corrective for the overzealousness of our individualism. Now, that being said, I'm not very comfortable leaving them like this, because I think what Seligman is talking about leaves some real important possibilities open. Two possibilities that I think it leaves open, and by the way, I think the rabbis left open as well. The first is the question I asked you about the sound of the shofar. That's a real possibility that this leaves open. And Rabbi Joseph Dov Soloveitchik, he was very worried. He was very worried about the idea of people trying to figure out where a ritual came from, its historical context, because he wanted something more constructive than that. So if you look with me at number 12, you'll find that he says something that I think is really significant for someone who appreciates the ambiguity. He says, at this point, many philosophers have blundered. The curse of the why question followed them relentlessly. As soon as they had begun to interpret religious phenomena causally, they negated their very object. Go to page 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top. Actually, let's do 6 lines down at the end of the line. The genetic. The genetic problem, that is the problem of trying to figure out the original context of certain acts and rituals, is the concern of the anthropologist and explanatory psychologist, but not of the philosopher. Now it follows that if sociological and psychological genetics are irrelevant to interpretation of causal designs, meaning it doesn't matter where it came from. Now it follows that if sociological and psychological genetics are irrelevant to the philosophy of science, there is no reason for the philosopher of religion to limit his or her interpretation to causal designs. In other words, I'm not asking a scientist to be subjective, and I'm not asking a scholar of religion to be objective. Unfortunately, while neither the mathematician nor physicist are troubled by the history of their disciplines, the philosopher of religion is still a slave to genetics. In contrast with genetic methodology, a philosophy of religion following a retrospective procedure from the objective to the subjective realm does not eliminate its own object. If you look at the next English paragraph, he's citing Maimonides' description of the shofar as an alarm clock that wakes us up. Look at the next paragraph, the alarm. The alarm of repentance, which for Maimonides is implied in the sounding of the shofar, cannot serve as the cause of the commandment that would assure it a status of necessity, but it must be apprehended rather as an allusion to a correlated subjective aspect. He wants constructive theology. He wants you to have a different experience from each other in understanding what's going on in this ritual. And that, in some ways, is what ambiguity allows. Now, of course, this is Rabbi Soloveitchik. It's bounded in certain ways. To what degree would people have different perspectives? And people sitting in this room will take this in their own lenses and will translate it the way that they want to translate it. But the point of not having one clear explanation necessarily of what it is, well, that's where you start getting constructive. That's where the sincere self actually can come in interesting ways that are unique and surprising. And the second opportunity that I think it makes available, and then after that I'm going to open for questions, is something that Robert Orsi writes about. And Robert Orsi is a chair of Catholic Studies at Northwestern. And I want to thank Yehuda Kurtzer for bringing this passage to my attention, because it's really something. What he's concerned about, you see the title, When 2 + 2 = 5. What he's concerned about is what he's calling the difference between presence and absence. This divide, he writes, between presence and absence. Oh, we're on page 10, number 14, Robert Orsi. This divide between presence and absence, between the literal and the metaphorical, between the supernatural and the natural, defines the modern Western world, and by imperial extension, the whole modern world. Imagine one of my Italian Catholic grandmothers going to see the statue of Mary in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She climbs the museum's steep steps rising from Fifth Avenue and pushes through the crowds and into the rooms of medieval art, where there are many lovely statues of the Blessed Mother, whom my grandmother knows and loves. My grandmother wants to touch the statues. She wants to lean across the velvet ropes, to kiss their sculpted robes, or to whisper her secrets and needs. But this is not how modern people approach art. For them, the statues are representations. We might say a mere external husk of a more internal, real idea. Illustrative of a particular moment of Western history and the history of Western art, and are to be admired for their form and their contribution to the development of aesthetic styles over time. There's nothing in them, no one there. The guards rush over and send my grandmother back out to the street. This is a parable of two ways of being in the world. One associated with the modern, although this is complicated clearly since my grandmother's lived in the modern world after all. And you can find believers in cathedrals throughout the world today petitioning statues. The other with something different from the modern. One is oriented toward presence in things. The other toward absence. As the guard rushing over shows, the difference is carefully policed. Certain ways of being in the modern world, certain ways of imagining it, are tolerable and others are not. Especially intolerable are ways of being and imagining oriented to divine presence. What he's really talking about here is he's really talking about the ability to actually jump into the as if. The authentic self does this a lot. You see my arms folded? Is that true? Is that real? Do I believe that? Is it going to do what I want it to do? That's what the authentic self does. You know what the ritual self does? The ritual self says, I'm going to jump in experience it, and figure out what it means as it's happening. The difference between looking for absence and looking for presence. And I think that in some ways, that is the secret to why people enjoy ritual in different ways. It's that as if. The very as if itself is a world that you're creating. When I stand in front of the Western Wall and imagine myself embedded in a history, and embedded perhaps in a conflict that's related to that history, you know that I'm standing in front of a wall, right? You know that I'm standing in front of an artifact, right? It takes my interest in presence, in seeing what's embodied here, in order to actually experience. Whereas if I were to try to figure out the truth of the matter and interrogate the truth of the matter, I would spend my entire time in a book trying to figure it out and lose the wall and the people who are in front of me. Those, I think, are two of the things that the focus on ritual makes possible. And to me, the most subversive piece, in my opinion, well, two subversive pieces. One subversive piece is to mention ritual and to say that this can apply to everyone who wants to engage in it. I think that's subversive. The second subversive piece is to say, wait a second, ritual has become fundamentalism because people choose to define it that way. And we don't have to choose to define it that way. And as leaders of the North American Jewish community, when we're inviting people into that pit with us, we're not making a cell here. We're not making a cell. We're inviting people in. We're actually saying if this is something that interests you, there's room for you in it. And I hope that this is kind of revolutionary for people. Thanks very much. Okay, I will take so many questions. Yes, in the back. Sir, can you just say your name? That's all. Thank you very much.
So many of us have had experiences of convicts coming up to us and saying, my mother died between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Is that what this prayer means? And the function of the actual is supposed to keep you whole. To keep you whole is one of the most salvific phrases in all of Judaism. The same keep you whole saying, no, it's not about your mother. It's as if you were standing in front. But the idea that people do take it very seriously is not something you can ignore lightly.
People take it incredibly seriously, and I think for that embodied reason. And I think what we see happening is people take storied rituals and imbue them with new meaning for what it means to them. And if you were to look at Seligman, he is not of the opinion that rituals necessarily stay the same throughout time. But it's the fact of a ritual itself which provides this opening for different definitions. And I'll just say one brief story. If you go to a Sephardic service on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you will hear happy tunes and smiley, and you're not going to get the 10 martyrs. You're not going to get it. So I had somebody in the synagogue where I was serving a few years back, and his in-laws were the rabbinic couple at a Sephardic synagogue just a few blocks from his house. So he had to go on high holidays. That was the right thing, sit with his kids, with the parent, etc. And I see him in synagogue, in our synagogue, our Ashkenazic synagogue. I said, what are you doing here? He said, I couldn't live without the 10 martyrs. I needed to hear that. Right? It's fascinating. Yeah, other questions? Yes. Thanks, Sissy. I think this relates so much to Heschel's leap of action. What I think is the difference is that I think the notion of ambiguity is a little bit less fervent than Heschel, right? Meaning Heschel has a fervor that he's bringing into the action, and certainly the Orsi text brings that, but there's also a person can leap into action without leaping. right? Meaning sometimes a person is very tentative or they're just there because they think somebody's pushing them to be there. And what I'm suggesting is that counts a whole lot, right? So that's how I think they're very different. Maybe on this side of the room so the boat doesn't tip over? Yes, David. But
I'm wondering if the tension of, like, how far would as if go? I mean, there's clearly the question before it breaks, and where the axis that you're creating between inside and outside is also has to be modified by these questions of moral consideration. Consideration is more easily argue for all manner of ethical and moral rituals that we ourselves would never play into that could come back again as if, and that's exactly the argument. So I wanted to correct one thing in the Kabbalistic model. The Kabbalistic model is actually not my idea in a very important way. Because the Kabbalists ontologize mitzvot and say that mitzvot are absolutely necessary for the fixing of the world, they wouldn't actually say that they were just a means towards an end. They would say they were the end in themselves. Even though they're both pointing in the direction of meaning and interiority, they wouldn't let go. So I'm wondering, like, where that tension for as if, emphasizing that most people come to us and say, I can't play the game of as if this because it's unethical. I can't play it as if this mitzvah is okay.
okay, so two responses. First of all, of course, because we're all interested in trying to get at the core of understanding. I just want to point out that my suggestion is not that the Zohar said that it's not ontological. My suggestion is that the Hasidim afterwards said that you need something in order to make it worthwhile, that they changed it. So that's one thing. But the second thing, I think that, and I mentioned this at the beginning, there are issues with Seligman's perspective just as much as there are issues with the other, and I actually don't think there's one unifying theory. What I'm hoping is that this allows for a different kind of conversation about ritual that is more, it's more shared in a way. But I don't think by any means that this is the end. Because I could easily go in the other direction. You're using the ethical. I could easily go in the, I want a mechitza for these reasons, and that's the as if I want to create. So we can argue about those things. But the point of not using ritual as a means to identity politics, not using ritual as a means to owning God or owning the Torah, or thinking that it's all about me. That's what I'm trying to combat. And you're right, there are limits to it, because sometimes I lose all of the me in that, and that could be a problem too. 100%. It's corrective. Yes. Jeffrey.
Looking from the Balchuva perspective, sort of doing the ritual, sort of faking it till you making it.
Mm-hmm.
Those community, is there sort of a sense of meaning? And one learn meaning when they are sort of like imitating others?
So I think one of the questions, he's asking, can one learn meaning as they're imitating others? So first of all, I think that the connection to other people is actually very meaningful in and of itself. Doing something that other people are doing actually creates a sense of connectedness, just starting right there. But besides for that, one of the questions that I think a lot about is, where does education fit into this? So that is to say, a person does a certain performance, and the more she reads about it, or learns about it, or thinks about it, the more it's sort of like an upward spiral. That it's just a different experience, in 3 years than it was last week even. And I think that that's actually completely understood as part of the ambiguity of ritual, which is to say your participation in it is your participation in it. What's going on inside changes over time. That's what I actually think. Yes, Adam, you had your hand up for a while. So one of the things that, did everybody hear the question? Okay. One of the things that Seligman is trying to do, and there's a lot more to read in Seligman, and I only gave you a small piece. One of the things he's trying to do is actually not so dissimilar, but is the opposite side of the coin of what Luzzatto was trying to do, which is to say there are a lot of people doing ritual, and I need to talk to people about sincerity, right? He's doing the opposite, which is there's a lot of sincerity in the 20th and 21st century, which is trying to figure out what we stand for, each one of us, and what it means to us, and in relationships too. But I actually want to add to the pile, he says, I want to add ritual. Because ritual sometimes, it can serve a purpose. So for example, you're in a fight with your sibling. You're in a fight with your sibling, and because you're in a fight with your sibling, you don't actually want to talk to them. But you know what you probably will still do? If you were going to go somewhere with the rest of your family, you'll probably both go to that place. That's an as if. You don't feel connected right now. You don't even want to be in the same room as that person. But actually being in the same room as that person is helpful. It's helpful for maintaining the relationship. Sorry.
I agree completely, but isn't it also an as if that is specifically trying to rebuild and rehabilitate the as is?
Yes.
It's not as if lishma, it's as if.
Yes, except the problem with the excessive focus on as is that you can't always know exactly what's going on in a person's mind. So like it's every human relationship. When you think you know what someone thinks about you, you don't. You think you do. And maybe you want to know and maybe you don't, but actually that ambiguity is helpful. Because if you knew exactly how a person thought about you, you might want to tweak how they think about you, and you can't. Right? That's really what it is. It's admitting that we don't know everything, and also admitting that if we did know everything, the nuanced differences would become mountains, and that wouldn't be a good thing, and that witch trials are started because of the interest in authenticity as the sole dominant motivating force. That makes sense? Yeah, Les.
I'm happy to stay in as if. I think as if is a reality in and of itself and is a perfectly good end goal. But I keep thinking back to your opening Misa of your father-in-law, Rabbi Kenny Hain Shlita, who dives in and everybody walks into the kever with him. I wish that were the paradigm in our world, at least in the world that we work in. I think in the world we work in, it's more the opposite. People say, I don't have the intellectual or the educational, the cultural, historical tools, Hebrew, or whatever you're doing, or maybe whatever you do. I don't know the niggin, I don't know what niggin is, I don't know. And that ability to say, I don't know enough to participate, to dive into your Kehillah ritual, allows me to express that, to enact that marvelous avoidance behavior of saying, since I don't know enough, I don't have to do it. I'm afraid to do it. You keep saying you're inviting me, but you're really pushing me away. Can you make some ritual that really does allow me to just jump into that muddy hole?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, how much do we admit as leaders that we don't always know why we're doing things? How much do we admit to that person who says to us, I don't know enough to do this? How much do we admit, some days I don't feel into it at all, and I do it anyway for XYZ reason? Meaning, how honest are we about that? I think, I'm not saying, look, I'm not a proselytizing person. It's not my way. I think that when things are compelling, they speak for themselves. But at the same time, I don't have to deal with people who come to me every day and say, I want to be in this, but I don't feel like I can be in this. But I think that there are ways of talking about ritual and thinking about ritual that aren't like this to this. Like, I'm talking from here down to you over there, but actually sharing a little bit of our own interiority. Like, when are the moments that, or as Jeffrey was saying, when was the first time I participated in this thing? And what did it mean to me then, and what does it mean to me now? And how it changed, and how it's different, and how silly that I thought I didn't know this or that, and then it turns out that everybody thought that way, and I didn't even realize. It's a different way. It's a different way. It's not the model of, oh, can you read from the siddur? Can I help you read from the siddur? It's not that. It's Hasidic, right? It's kind of Hasidic. It's, you're reading upside down? That's a great start. Like, that's what you're feeling. What does that mean to you? Let me show you how I do it. Like, it's a little bit of that. Yeah, thank you. Great questions all around. Yes, sir, you've had your hand up, and then we're going to go back to it. Your name? Ian, hi. So you're asking for the rabbis themselves to admit that they might have a gap in their own intention, or they might not be sure. I have to give some thought to that. Let me take a few more questions and I'll give thought to that. I'm serious. I don't really answer on one foot unless I have like a real answer. So I'm going to think about that. Brent, you had your hand up before.
So it seems like many of the conversations about being able to enter into a shared ambiguous ritual space assume a certain level of some level of familiarity and comfort just with the idea of the ritual itself, and B, and perhaps even more important in the context I'm in, a belief that that shared space can be found exclusively or at least primarily in that shared space. But what I'm wondering is, at least in the context I'm in, and I suspect I'm not unusual in this regard, my people can find community, can find connection in a whole variety of circumstances. Jewish, not religious, swimming pool, little league, etc. And so simply the idea of coming together in community is insufficient.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, in what ways does the teleological approach, either the rationalists like Hartman or the mystics, not still have to govern in order to make the claim, come enter into my ambiguous ritual space, because it will in some way give you a telos, improve your life in some way?
I think what you're saying is very true. I don't think that these things are mutually exclusive, but I think that this is an important footnote. Now, the question of what people get out of some of these spaces that we make. I'm not the hokiest person out there, so I'm not necessarily going to ask everybody sitting around, and not that this makes you hokey, all right, maybe I did something wrong. I'm not going to necessarily go around and say, what does this mean to you every 3 seconds while we're doing it, blah, blah, blah. And again, I'm going to go back to the honesty and not proselytizing, which is the sense of, I find this meaningful, I think it's compelling. If you think there's something compelling about it too, you belong here too, and let's learn about it and let's talk about it. But for me, it's a tough business to be in, other than to say to people, I want you to actually reflect on why you want to or don't want to be here. And let's talk about it, or maybe try something before you know exactly what the telos is that it's going to give you. You absolutely can.
I feel like, just to follow up on what you said about the honesty for us as leaders, about not always knowing why we're doing things, I think actually it also requires a step further and acknowledging that even or down to us as leaders, sometimes these things aren't working. I've been keeping kosher for 25 years, and you know what? I don't get that much out of it. It's not just that I don't know why I'm doing it. It's at a certain point saying, you know what? This actually might not be working. It's not a mystery, it's a failure.
Well, so one of the things that you're actually talking about is this question of whether the inner and the outer always have to be connected. Which is to say, there are certain things that I do that I feel very internally connected to. There are other things that I do out of a sense of obligation, and that obligation can come from lots of different places. And just actually talking about that stuff, I think that's, that's the joke. I'm trying to get you away from being focused so much on the inner self so that you can go back and let people be focused on their inner selves. That's what I'm trying to do here. Because I have no problem walking in with a sense of obligation about mitzvot for myself, personally. And to say to somebody, I want to tell you why I keep kosher and what it does for me, and I want to hear what you think of it. Period. Like, I have no problem with that conversation. I actually think that's a very healthy conversation, because guess what? I don't own kosher. And neither do you. Everybody owns it. So that's the thing, right? That's the big it here. It's ownership. It's proprietorship, right? If somebody is really driven to something, they're driven to it because there's something to commit to, not because they want to own it, not because it's theirs. And that, I think, is a big problem in religion. I think everybody thinks it's theirs, right? I don't know what the order was anymore. Yes, sir. Your name.
My name's Brad.
Hi, Brad.
This whole idea of pan-Jewish ritual, in my mind, taking the term from Rabbi Steinberg's essay, to hold with open arms, to be able to hold something with open arms is to have so much of what you just talked about,
Mm-hmm.
and giving space,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to live in that paradox. I think is also allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. I think so much of this has to do with vulnerability and acceptance of vulnerability. And that's where real, in my mind, ritual really comes to play. Those most amazing moments, those radical amazement, are when I'm most vulnerable. And I think when we allow...
Well, you know what's a great example? So the Kaddish is a great example. If you read the words of the Kaddish are saying how great God is. That's not generally what a person is feeling when they lose a loved one, especially in certain circumstances. And yet there's clearly a lot going on for people, because a lot of people like the Kaddish. So is the Kaddish giving me some sort of as-if space where I can proclaim something that I'm maybe feeling very conflicted about inside? Is the Kaddish allowing me to argue it out loud? Is the Kaddish just giving me a place to sleep where basically you have other people around you who are going to look at you in an empathetic way and who are going to recognize what you're doing as an impulse that they relate to? There's a lot going on in there. And to be honest, the same way the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah has these different registers, and it's not just the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, it's the Gemara in Brachot also, that has these different registers. One register is understanding the words of the Shema and what you're saying. Another register is doing something for the purpose of it being a ritual act, and in the rabbi's understanding, an obligation, a commandment. Then there's a third of what it actually means to you while it's happening. So you can actually leave the first two as something people disagree on completely. And you can still talk about that third register as something shared. And that's pretty amazing. I think we should take one more, only because we've taken a lot of questions. Oh, I'm in trouble now. I had to do eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Sir, because your hand was up for longest, I think. Sorry, Jackie. Sorry, Deanie. Yes.
Hi, I'm Dan.
Hi, Dan.
So, a teacher of mine, Carol Ox, said that covenant is an agreement that you enter into, not fully realizing what it is that you're agreeing to, but knowing it will have the power to change your life. And so one of the things that I really resonated to in your teaching was this idea of ambiguity. Because I think that all the energy in the universe moves in waves. And I think that one's capacity to approach ritual is often modular.
Right, so part of that, I think, is the question of education. Right, meaning one of the things that we're here for in our pulpits, in our educational leadership, we're here to say, we're happy to learn with you. We're happy to study with you. We're happy to give a class on XYZ. We're happy to hold a conversation at our table about A, B, and C. But I don't want to pretend, and this is in the Catherine Bell text that, hopefully you'll read when you have time. But I don't want to pretend that I think ritual is like the Rorschach test and can mean anything about anything. I used to have a teacher in high school who would say, no, you can't read Mark Twain as being about a penguin's debutante ball. That's what she would say. Like, there are limits to what things mean. And the question is, where are your limits? Different people have different limits, obviously. But that's where I think education comes in. But I think an education that is wide and varied and has options for people to understand what meaning is in there. One of my least favorite things is that sometimes you'll look in a high holiday machzor, and the prayer book will say, when you listen to the shofar, you should have in mind these 10 meanings of the shofar. And that bothers me because what it immediately does is it says, A, if you don't have one of those, you're missing the boat. And this is not talking about whether this is a religious ritual. It's talking about, do you hear it as a cry? Do you hear it as this? But B, what it's doing is it's inhibiting your ability to actually choose one that speaks the most to you this year and speaks the most to you, a different one next year and a different one the year after that. It's about absence. It's not actually about presence. And I think that that's highly problematic. So I hope that everyone filters this through their own lens. And thank you very much. Go eat some lunch, people. The ritual of eating lunch. Enjoy.